Ingredients: walnut, an elaborate bending form, tricky and somewhat sketchy curvy operations, custom brass details, some wacky and out-of-the-box operations with the shape or origin, burl veneer, delicate joinery, strategically hidden magnets, and LED lighting make what I think is the coolest piece I've ever built. And it all started with a prompt in AI. All right, let's get right into it. Here is the design rendering generated by an AI bot called Midjourney based on my prompt. And I'll leave the prompt on screen down at the bottom for you to read while I quickly draw out this shape in Shaper Studio and get ready to cut out a template. Now, I did many variations of this prompt, but I kept coming back to the original design. Now, we are absolutely going to get into the pros and cons of using AI for design and why I decided to use it on this project. But first, let's use the Shaper Origin to cut the general shape of this cabinet so I can then begin actually designing it from the ground up, including joinery and details and proportions. And that's really the nuts and bolts of any piece of furniture. Anybody can draw something or have it rendered, but is it buildable? Is it functional? And is it practical? And does it actually look good? Now, after prototyping this design for a couple of days, I took a road trip down to Philly to see my buddy Eric Curtis and get his input.
But then that also, it creates that taper that goes from 0 out here.
Yeah. See, this is where I would put LEDs behind here.
Oh, hell yeah.
And do some kind of pattern in here. I don't know what.
And then Larissa Huff popped in and gave us some more ideas to think about. And after that much appreciated design Philly powwow, it was back to my shop to start making the bending forms for the cabinet case. Now, this is going to be a 2-part bending form made out of several layers of 3/4 inch thick MDF.
Okay, since this bent lamination is actually going to wrap all the way around on itself, I thought it best to make a 2-part form, where you have the interior where the laminations wrap around, and then you have an exterior form where I can apply clamping pressure at the correct angle to make sure that all my laminations squeeze together tightly. So all I did to get this outer radius was I set the shaper here to a 2 5/8 inch offset from this cut, which set that 2 5/8. Now it goes all the way around. Now, I've never made a form like this, so I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert, but I've read books. This one specifically, Wood Bending Made Simple, where, as you can see, he has all of these different parts of the form numbered so they line up with each other and it's the correct radius and shape. Now, his form doesn't wrap around on itself, but the theory remains the same.
Now, what I learned is the key to having this multi-piece outer bending form is to be sure you number everything. That way, each part of that outer radius matches perfectly with the inner radius. You see, because this isn't a perfect circle, those outer clamping blocks aren't interchangeable. And once I had that first inner form and outer form cleaned up and nice and smooth, those became the captains, or the template masters that all the other layers would be made from. But in the interest of efficiency, I thought it wise to glue up 2 layers of MDF at a time, and then I could glue those multi-layer sections into one thick and beefy MDF sandwich at the end. And so began the long and arduous process of gluing, screwing, tracing, and cutting all the subordinate layers to rough size before template routing. Now, good dust collection is an absolute lifesaver when cutting through this nasty MDF. And after all my sub-assemblies were glued up and flush trimmed, it was time to start layering them into larger sub-assemblies before the final assembly. I used some 1/4-inch drill bits to keep them aligned, and then it was just rinse and repeat for the other sub-assemblies: glue, screw, clamp, and then Shopcat Jerry needed a little attention. And probably something to eat. And to keep everything in alignment for the final glue up, I made some long dowels and whack-a-moled those home. Now, to make this form took more than a day, but starting with a neat, clean, and accurate bending form is a key element in the bending process. You don't want to take shortcuts because they will come back to bite you down the road. Okay, what I need to do now is drill holes in this inner bending form so that I can put clamps in there and apply pressure. So for this particular F-style clamp, I need 1.5 inch hole. So I'm just going to go around the interior here and try to equally space these. And also keeping in mind that I want to make sure that these clamps don't interfere with each other. For example, on this corner here, I want pressure here and here, but I also want it across the middle. But I can't fit 3 clamps right there, so for these 2, I'll make the holes close, and then here I will set it back further. All right, these are all laid out now, so let's make some MDF Swiss cheese. Yummy. Now, since the bottom of the cabinet will actually run past the side, I needed to modify the bending form a little bit, which we will get into in more detail when I do a dry run of the bending process. All right, let's pick out some walnut. Now, whether you're steam bending or doing bent lamination like we're doing here, ideally you want to get air-dried lumber. Air-dried lumber is dried much more slowly, so it's removing that moisture at a slower rate, which helps keep those wood fibers more flexible and not brittle like kiln dry does. Kiln dry heats that up to such a high temperature, creates case hardening possibly, and really locks those wood fibers together, making it more difficult to bend. So I only have a few pieces here, but I'm trying to find one with straight grain and no knots. And I really only need one piece that's about 6 feet long. Well, that's not entirely true. Based on the thickness of the material and how thick my laminations were going to be and how I was going to have to resaw them and plane them smooth, I really needed 2 pieces, just to be sure I had enough strips and a couple extra. Now, to make sure I realign my boards all in the same orientation, I put a reference triangle on the end grain. And now to start resawing, which it was only a couple of boards, so it didn't take that long. But I do want to draw your attention to the giant red and black spring-loaded featherboard I'm using. Now, I bought this from VAD Concepts, and this is the first time I'm using it. And I gotta say, I was pretty impressed. It has a lot of spring tension to keep your workpiece against the fence, and it locks tightly in the miter slot. So if you do a lot of resawing, I highly suggest checking this out. I'll leave a link in the description below. Now, you've heard of the Bourbon Moth Domino Hip Thrust. Well, this is the resawing push stick thrust. It is a little slower and not as exciting though. Now, when resawing, there's a lot of back and forth between the bandsaw and then going back to the planer to clean up the saw marks for a fresh face, and then back to the bandsaw, which is why it's really not my favorite activity. But that sweet slap of walnut makes it all worth it. Now is the fun task of running all these 1/8 inch strips through the planer to get them as thin as I can down to the final bendable thickness, which we don't really know what it is yet. Now, the other thing to use in this process is a sacrificial bed that I will slide in here and put on top of the existing bed. Now, my machine will only go down to about 1/4 inch thickness, and I need to go way down to about 3/32 or a little less. So this 5/8 sled allows me to do that. So just make sure this is waxed
and as non-slip as it can be so those pieces will pass right through.
And by holding these pieces high and bending them into the cutter, it helps to alleviate the feed roller from lifting up the front and turning it to mulch on the cutter.
Okay, so somehow, miraculously, I was able to get these down to 0.073 inches off of the planer, which is somewhere between a 16th and 5/64ths, or for you metric people, 1.86 millimeters. All right, let's see what we get here. Whoa. Okay. Okay, I didn't hear any cracking or anything. This is bent, that's even tighter. Oh, these are all good signs here. I don't think I'm gonna have to steam this. Not having to pre-bend this, that's gonna save a lot of frustration.
Now by pre-bending, I meant steaming or soaking the strips, then bending them around the form, letting it sit overnight and those boards acclimate to that shape, then removing them, drying them, and then starting the final glue up process. The difficulty with that is now your strips are in some sort of curved shape, which makes it difficult to apply glue. So having them flat is a big advantage.
Okay, that went really well. All the laminations are pretty tight. And I actually flipped this whole thing over and everything was tight on the bottom. So I don't think I'll need to do clamps top and bottom. So that's huge. Now I want to talk about this intersection here for a minute. You can see this pencil line here, which is supposed to be the flat bottom. But as you can see, my laminations run at an angle. The reason for this is I need to make a solid joint here. If I were to wrap this lamination all the way around as a butt joint here, getting that perfect would be virtually impossible. So I've left this a little bit long so that I can either square it off or put a tenon on there. And then what I'll do once this is all dried is I have this little arrow here, is I will cut this, and whatever miter angle that needs to be, I will then domino those two pieces together to give me that flat section all the way across. I'm going to drill 2 new holes here and here. That way I can put a clamp here and a clamp here rather than bridging over, which I had originally planned on.
And to prevent excess epoxy squeeze out from going all over your form, I line it completely with packing tape. I'm also going to put a layer of tape on my outer lamination as well as my inner lamination, because if those get covered in epoxy, it's just a pain in the butt to clean off.
Total boat, baby.
Total Boat high performance epoxy with medium hardener. If you're doing a more elaborate glue up, then you could probably use the slow hardener. But based on the dry run, I'm confident the medium hardener will give me plenty of open time. And I've found using a foam roller gives you a nice even film thickness and greatly reduces any squeeze out that you may get. People have the tendency to pour it on here where it's just not necessary. And I'm just applying epoxy to one side of the laminations. I really don't think it's necessary to do both. You'll see I get enough squeeze out, just the right amount where it doesn't start going everywhere, but yet I'll still get good adhesion throughout. I also took another precaution to avoid any catastrophic messes, and that was to put a sheet of plastic on my workbench. Since nothing really sticks to that, it's the perfect protective layer to put down on your bench, especially when working with epoxy.
As you notice, I'm working from one end all the way around. That pushes that wave of excess adhesive that's in there out towards the end.
And done. That took about 15 minutes.
It's a lot of clamps, so I'm gonna fast forward. All right, so the spring back here is quite noticeable. Geez, that's kind of nuts. This is where things get a little sticky. For this end, I'm going to carry this over to here. So it's this point right here where I need to make my cut. So I'm not sure what this angle is going to be yet. Then once I make that cut on both sides and join it back together, it will be perfectly 90 degrees to this side here. This is why the spring back factor doesn't really matter, because I'm going to correct that here. Put my pencil in there. So I need to find out what this angle is here and then divide it in half, and that will give me what my miter angle is.
Survey says 10.5 degrees, which means each miter will need to be 5.25 degrees.
Okay, I already ran one edge across the jointer. Forgot to film that. So now with that jointed edge, I can put it up against the fence and make a parallel edge on the other side. Now this is not a technique or a cut to be taken lightly. So if it's not something you feel comfortable with, do not do it. But there's 3 things to note here on where your pressure needs to be. It's downward against the table, laterally against the fence, and forward through the cut. 3 directions. So if at any moment you're only 2 out of those 3, something bad could happen. So I'm going to take this very slow and controlled, and I'll end up with a decent cut.
And to be honest, I just free-handed this cut to get this angle correct. Whew. Okay. That's not too bad. We can make that work. Now, unfortunately, my original plan of using the domino wasn't going to work because this curved side of the lamination has no flat surface. However, using this doweling jig, I can put a little wedge in there and then clamp it down to keep it secure. Now, if I had a bunch of these to do, yeah, I'd have to come up with some kind of a jig, but for one, I think we're good. Okay, let's get back to the AI discussion, because I know some of you are probably hot under the collar that I would dare to use AI to design a piece of furniture. And while that concern is valid, it's worth diving deeper. Now, even if you create your own design, as I and many of you have done, you're likely drawing inspiration, consciously or not, from things you've seen. So where's the line? For me, it's clear. And that is when someone takes an AI-generated design, claims it as their own, and profits from it, whether at scale or in limited runs. That is downright unethical. For this cabinet, my goal was to greatly improve the design, better my skills in bent lamination and veneer work, and to push the boundaries of using the shaper origin, which you'll see later in the video. And while I would love to see this cabinet every day, I actually will be giving it away as a gift to a friend because sharing my work with my friends and family brings me just as much joy. And if you remember from the rendering I showed at the beginning, it wasn't even buildable. It shows no seam around the case where the front panel meets it, the drawer has no top, and the side of the drawer has nothing to register against. It's super cool, but you can tell after looking at it for a minute that, yeah, this thing's not real. Okay, because this case is going to be tapered, what I did was I took one of the extra laminations and I cut it on the bandsaw, and now I have clamped it to the case and I am just tracing that line all the way around. And I'll use that as my guideline for cutting. Somehow.
Jerry, how am I going to do this? I don't know, buddy. Jigsaw, bandsaw, table saw, handsaw. I can't do it that way.
So my original bandsaw idea wasn't going to work. A handsaw was just going to be, well, not as fast and accurate as the table saw here. And at this point, I thought it somewhat prudent to do some glue-ups, the first being the back of the cabinet, which is going to be about 3/8 of an inch thick, and the other was the little built-in integrated shelf nook cubby thing at the bottom of the cabinet. Now that terminology will become much more clear as that piece begins to take shape, but for right now, that's the nomenclature I'm going with. Now, one of the features of this cabinet is going to be a round mirror with a custom brass frame around it. And it will be backlit with LEDs. And to be 95% transparent, my initial thought was to just buy a mirror with a brass frame. Unfortunately, I couldn't find one anywhere. So, challenge accepted. Let's make one. And the first step was to glue up a mitered walnut frame. And with that in the clamps, now we can return to that shelf cubby nook thing that I mentioned earlier, which required another glue up. So we'll set that off to the side. Now, the curved panel that I'm going to make on the right side of the cabinet, as well as the section below it, are going to be veneered with this beautiful walnut burl veneer that I got from my buddy Mike Coffey at Coffey Custom Builds. Now, rather than laminate it to MDF or plywood, I'm laminating it directly to solid walnut. Now, I'm using quarter sawn walnut, which is very stable, and I feel that whatever movement happens, the burl veneer will move with it. Hey, it's Shopcat Lola. Now, why is she shaven like that, you may ask? Well, after many, many years of post-surgical complications of a surgery she had when she was a kitten, she just had double ureteral reimplantation surgery. Incredibly invasive, incredibly risky, but her recovery has been extremely swift, and she is doing fantastic, thanks to the unbelievable doctors at the University of Pennsylvania Veterinary Hospital. Now, I had that in the vac bag for a couple of hours, but since it was sealed with no air getting to it, that glue wasn't able to completely cure. And rather than put it flat down on the bench, you want to treat it like you're stacking and stickering lumber after the first round of milling to allow equal airflow all the way around. Now, this cabinet can most likely be described as a curvilinear design, right? We have curves, we have some straight lines, and the hope is they all blend into a nice, cohesive design that when you step back and look at it, it's pleasing to the eye and it just works. And for this bottom platform shelf, I'm actually scooping out the top to follow the grain pattern, which I think will create a nice flow and have your eye follow that grain along left to right and then up around the cabinet. Hopefully that works. So I traced the inside and then used a 3/8 spacer to basically make a dotted line all the way around, connected those dots, and then cut it out on the table saw, the miter saw, and the bandsaw. Oh boy, rabbiting bit on the router table. Now I was a little scared on tear out on this. So what I did was with a marking gauge, I went all the way around the inside of the case and scored that first layer of walnut to minimize any tear out that might happen. And it seemed to work pretty well. So the only other thing to do was to square up that corner and then test fit the back. Now, one of the most difficult parts of this cabinet was scribing and fitting this bottom shelf nook to the actual case. What looks like about 5 seconds took me 2 to 3 hours of fiddling and fine-tuning to get it just right. Now we're back to that custom brass mirror frame. So this is about 1 mil sheet of brass that I am now gluing to that walnut frame. Now the reason I had mitered this frame was because once I cut the circle out of it, I didn't want there to be any end grain showing. Well, correction. There will be some end grain, but if I had just glued up boards side to side, there would have been a lot of end grain. And while that Total Boat Thixo tip was hot, I decided I may as well get the cabinet case glued up as well. Now, since you're gluing a curved piece into a straight piece, it gets a little wonky. So I actually made a clamping block out of one of the offcuts from the bending form, which I clamped to the case, and then I could clamp horizontally and get nice even pressure across the joint. And a clamping square in the corner, make sure that the bottom is square to the side. And if you saw my last video on my niece's desk, you saw me using these double-sided grit grip sanding sponges. Yeah, they're legit. There's a link in the description. Now, for those of you that have never seen the Shape of Origin before, it's essentially a portable CNC that uses black and white domino tape to accurately locate the workspace that you are cutting within. It has a very intuitive interface, and you are able to store any files that you create inside your Shaper Hub, which you can access directly from Origin's touchscreen. Now, at the beginning of the video, you saw me create the shape of this cabinet using Shaper Studio, which is a web-based program, and it's where I create the majority of my files because it's so easy. Now, for something as simple as this circle, you could actually create it right on tool, right on the touch screen, and never have to go to your computer. So even if you have no experience with a CNC, it is extremely intuitive, and it's not only for the hobbyists, but also professionals. And here's what the team at Shaper recommends for cutting this brass. 5mm O flute, spindle speed 3, and a depth of cut at 0.01. You know, some people cringe at the sound of fingernails on a chalkboard or resawing on the bandsaw, but cutting brass with a router, yeah, that's right up there.
So as you can see, I made it through the brass down to the walnut. Took 6 passes at 0.01 inches per pass. So before I go all the way through with the outer cut, I'm going to cut the rest of the brass on the inside to get all that done and out of the way, and then move on to the walnut final cuts.
Now, one of the downsides of having to make multiple passes on this brass and having the tool flat down on the material is some of those chips get loose, get stuck to the underside, and you end up scratching the surface. And that was after vacuuming after each pass, the material and the underneath of the origin. So it's just something to keep in mind. And once the ring was separated from its body, I cleaned up the inside and outside with the little spindle sander on the drill press, and I also decided to chamfer the edges of the brass just to soften it a little bit. Now we needed to make a template for the half-moon shaped walnut burl panel. Now the tricky part was the final radius on the outside wasn't the inside of the cabinet or the outside. It was right in the middle because it was going to sit in a groove. I thought about this several ways. And what I came up with was a multi-step process, but will be the most accurate. But first, and remember how I said you could just create things on tool? Well, here I'm just creating a 12 5/8 inch circle, and you can adjust the anchor point, and I'm going to drop it right in this spot here. Now, this was not a defined shape for the panel of this cabinet. It was just something that I thought looked good, and it fit the space, and so I cut it. Sometimes you just got to wing it, or moon it. In this case, half moon it. Okay, so here is my multi-step process. First of all, I needed to make this 1/4 of an inch smaller. So with a rabbiting bit set at 1/4 of an inch, I made a first pass. And then using a flush trimming bit, I took that lip off and now it's 1/4 of an inch smaller. Now I did screw this to my burl veneered panel, which broke my heart, but it's on the inside and you will never see those screw holes. But then I could flush trim my actual burl panel before starting the next stressful operation, which was cutting a rabbet in that outside radius, which would essentially create a tongue that will fit in a forthcoming groove in the cabinet case. Now the inside was a little simpler. This was just a rough cut and another flush trim. But there were still some sketchy operations yet to do. But at this point, it was looking pretty good. Had no tear out and no accidents, and it looks like it fits the case nicely. But how am I going to cut that 1/4 inch groove in the cabinet case because it's tapered? My first thought was to do it with a handheld router, but the second I turned that bit on, it was like a helicopter and wanted to fly out of my hand. So I decided to do it on the router table. And as you can see, I'm making small, controlled bites here. Because this is tapered, I needed to make sure that whatever was coming in contact with the router bit was flat on the table. If I just went in one full pass all the way around, it would have rocked back and forth and created a really sloppy, choppy groove. Very similar to me on the dance floor. Ooh, and then one final rabbet on that panel. That was the scariest bit, because if that had tore out, I would have been in Bonnie. Rubble. Trouble. And who doesn't love a little hand tool work? Now, the groove in this shelf was cut on the router table. I didn't film that. It wasn't a big deal. And the end of the shelf was cut at about a 22-degree bevel and a 1.5-degree miter to fit in the case. All right. Who am I, Eric Curtis? Annie Hoosiers, we've hit a bit of a design, speed bump, roadblock, brick wall, in fact, you might say, with this area right here. Now, after seeking out some design assistance from my phone and friend Paul Jasper at Copper Big Fine Woodworking, he had a great idea. Now it's trying to bring it to life, but I'm going to show you what he suggested and what some other alternatives were. Okay. So this area was originally going to be some sort of a vertical grain panel, which would contrast to this horizontal grain and with the burl veneer here. But
it just doesn't look right to me. So I went through a couple different iterations with a burl panel looking like this curve to complement this curve, but that just didn't look quite right to me either. Then there was this option where this panel came all the way down and was recessed into this, and then there'd be some sort of break here, maybe a little brass inlay, but something to continue that curve down, which isn't a bad choice. Paul suggested using the walnut burl veneer, making a little door here that uses a brass pin all the way through from here, through the door and into this shelf as the hinge, and then making a brass pull. This opens, and then you have a little cubby in there. Because now it's not only form, but it's also function.
Spoiler alert, after thinking through that a little bit more, I realized the brass pin as a hinge wasn't going to work, but the panel itself would. Now, to dish out the little recess in this bottom shelf nook thing, I've employed the use of not only Shaper Origin, but also of Shaper Workstation, which is a fantastic way to hold small or larger pieces without having to create a workspace on your bench, since the workstation has a built-in workspace. Now, the first step was to cut the majority of the waste using the pocket feature. Then I switched to the inside path and came up with this. Okay, we have a flat bottom and square walls, but let's give those a rounded contour. I adjusted the offset of the same path that I just used, went around, and came up with this. Now that looks much nicer. And since I decided to put that panel in the bottom of the cabinet, it required a little more burl veneering. As you can see, I'm using this Express Veneer Adhesive from veneersupplies.com, and it's extra dark. Because this burl has a ton of pinholes in it, if any of that shows through, it's nice to have the dark wood glue below. And a little trick I learned from Nick Padula to prevent any glue from getting on the inside of your vac bag was to put a sheet of wax paper on the top and bottom. Now, typically I use shrink wrap, but wax paper is way easier. Now, to create a template for that little access panel, I reused my half moon template until I found exactly where it fit right, cut it, and there you go. Then I could template route that onto a bigger template, but I'd have to set that off to the side for now because I had more important things to do according to Shopcat Jerry, and that was to work on the mirror. Now, my original plan was just to mount this mirror inside of the cabinet and somehow put LED lighting in there, but I didn't really think that through. And as I did think it through, I realized, hey, it would be much better if it was offset off the back and allow the LED lights to be mounted back there. So in order to do that, I used the Shaper Origin to cut this little walnut disc. Look, a wagon wheel. And a little India ink to darken that edge and keep it hidden in the shadows. So by epoxying this walnut disc to the mirror, it's going to serve two purposes. It's going to offset it from the back of the cabinet, leaving room for that LED lighting, but it's also going to allow me to screw through the back of the cabinet to mount it and screw my aluminum French cleat through the back of the cabinet, which is how it will mount on the wall. Now it's back to the access panel door. So with some double-sided tape, I could stick it down onto my veneered panel, then rough it out on the table saw and the bandsaw, flush trim it up, and go back to that hair-raising operation of cutting that rabbet and checking the fit. That is going to work. A quick cut to length, and then over to the drill press where I'm working on some magnets. Thought the best way for this door to stay in place is dos magnito. So I cut a little divider, embedded some magnets in there, as well as corresponding ones in the back of the panel, veneered that exposed edge on the divider, and now for the next operation, I needed to make sure the case was locked in place. So I got all the holes pre-drilled, countersunk, and the screws installed for the back of the cabinet. And then it was time to cut a mortise. Now, because this case was tapered on the front, it only had a back flat reference surface. So the Shaper Workstation, although it took a while to get set up, was the perfect tool to get a mortise in the exact location that went directly through the bottom of the cabinet into the side. And here's where the Origin really shines. Now I can take that same file and cut on the outer path to create a perfectly fitted tenon. But I also wanted to bling up this tenon with a brass wedge. So with a 1/32 bit on the Shaper Origin, I cut this, which was a perfect fit for that brass. And after trimming that tenon to size and the brass to size, I could glue in that tenon, and then using epoxy, I could glue in that brass wedge. and after the epoxy and glue was dry, I used this little trim router setup to get as close to the surface I could before sanding it and ending up with that. But I wasn't done there with wacky setups with the Origin. This time I'm using shaper plate rather than workstation because with that bottom shelf running past the side, there was just no way to get clean access to where I needed to put these mortises. Now I still needed to make some custom tenons to fill those mortises, but I wanted to get a jump start on all the finishing first, because in order to put those tenons in, that meant gluing in the shelf, but I wanted the inside of the case to be pre-finished first. Now, if you've seen any of my recent videos, you've seen me use this LED cured finish. It's a hard wax oil. It dries almost instantly under this powerful LED light, and this particular one is Heidelberg Pro Lignum. Now, this is the part of the process where things really started to come together. I could get this bottom shelf nook glued in, then I could work on the side burl panel, then that horizontal shelf, and the last thing was that little burl divider with the magnets. And now it was mini tenon time on the side of the cabinet. Now, I'm just gluing these in for now. The brass will come later. Now for the brass pull on that access panel, I asked my buddy Tom and the machinist to make it on his full-size CNC. It has a tenon on the bottom, which when I use the shaper calipers, which connect to Origin wirelessly, it plugs in those dimensions automatically to ensure a perfect fit. So just pressing this button, it transfers to the machine, and I'm ready to cut. And now we test fit. Perfect. Now, there were some machine marks left to clean up from the CNC, so after some fine grit sandpaper, I get a nice brushed finish. And a little Renaissance wax to seal it. Not sure how long that's really going to last. I mean, brass is soft, fingerprints, it scratches just by pointing at it, but it'll look nice for a few minutes. To hold that mirror in place while I flipped this cabinet over with clamps was very nerve-wracking, because all I had to do was crack that mirror and I would have had to start that whole mini project all over again. Now, I went back and forth on how to conceal this motion sensor for the LED lighting, so I made this little block, and we'll let that dry and come back to it later. But let's get these brass wedges done. I'm just going to use CA glue on this. These are small, and this should give them plenty of holding power. Now, the idea of the shelf running past the cabinet was my buddy Eric Curtis's, which is a fantastic one, and I went back and forth on what to put on there, but I wanted it to be some sort of bowl for keys. My initial thought was ceramics, but everything I found didn't quite work. You'll have to wait to the end to see what I went with, but the hidden magnets might be a dead giveaway. Now, there's nothing special about these LED lights. It's just a little rechargeable kit with a motion sensor that I found on Amazon. I'll leave the link below. But I got the black ones because I wanted to make sure they blended in and were noticeable like white would be. And I liked that the wires and the motion sensor were also black. And I was really hoping these LEDs wouldn't be so bright that they would be in your face and detract from the overall look of the cabinet. They were just supposed to provide a subtle, warm glow. Now, this doesn't really show off exactly the look, but I knew at this point they weren't too bright. Now, I've had my issues with French cleats in the past, but not with these aluminum ones. And these are cheap and effective and easy to mount. And with that mounted, the only thing left to do was to apply the rest of the finish on the outside of the cabinet and any other areas that I had missed, which fortunately on a small cabinet like this really wasn't anything. And then it was final assembly. Now, you'll notice a little electrical tape on the back. That was to hide any LED lights that are back there because the whip itself was very short and the LED slack that was left had to go somewhere. So that's where it went. And this awesome steel bowl was cold forged by my buddy John Ariani at Sunset Forge NJ. So, AI for furniture design, good or bad? For me, it has its place. It was a great starting point for this cabinet that led me down many roads of design options and obstacles to overcome, and it really challenged me as a woodworker and designer. And that's what we want, right? To be challenged and get better? That is absolutely part of the thrill for me as a furniture maker. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.